And we are live.
Hi, if you're just logging on, I want to welcome you to today's program. We'll take a few minutes and make sure everyone has a chance to log on. We do have the chat open. Always wonderful to see where you're from, or if you want to say hello to any of us, we'd be delighted to hear from you. Good afternoon. If you're just logging on, I want to welcome you to today's program. We'll take just a minute at the beginning to make sure everyone has a chance to log on. Go ahead if you feel like it, put something in the chat. Particularly if you're not from Oregon, we're always interested to know where people are zooming in from. Thank you. And we'll start in just a minute or two. Good afternoon. If you're just logging on, we're going to take one more minute to make sure everyone has a chance to log on. You're welcome to, I see some people are saying where you're zooming in from in the chat, and we'd love to hear from any of you who want to put a note in the chat. Thank you. I feel like we have to pretend we're in an auditorium and there's this buzz of sound and we're all speaking with one another. All right, I think we will get started. I want to welcome everyone today. My name is Judy Margles. I'm the director at the Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for Holocaust Education here in Portland. I do want to welcome everyone to today's program, History, Place, and the Reckoning with Pioneer Monuments and Memorials. Our mission at the museum is to explore the legacy of the Jewish experience in Oregon, teach the universal lessons of the Holocaust, and provide opportunities for intercultural conversation. We challenge visitors to resist indifference and discrimination and to envision a just and inclusive world. I want to extend my gratitude to the Oregon Historical Society for co-sponsoring today's program. OHS's values closely align to our work, and I'm forever grateful to partner with the organization, and in particular, Eliza Canty-Jones, on programs that stretch and deepen our understanding of some of the most urgent issues facing us today. We offer all of our virtual programming, including today's event and recording of past events, without charge. We're always grateful for any donation that you might make to help us or our partner organization, the Oregon Historical Society. Today's program participates in the long overdue disputes over the role played by statues and memorials in our public spaces. The protests that we've seen across the country underscore how these prominent symbols have revealed a deepening divide in the debate over historical memory. Portland, as it's located near the end of the Oregon Trail, has its own distinct connection to pioneer memory. Early public monuments declared the city and its citizens to be civilized by emphasizing the region's transition from indigenous peoples to white settlement. I think of two statues, both in Washington Park, Sacagawea by Alice Cooper, honoring the pioneer mother of Old Oregon. She was a famed Shoshone interpreter and guide, of course, to the Lewis and Clark Exposition. And the nearby Coming of the White Man. This was a statue created by Herman McDeal that was erected for the 1905 Lewis and Clark Exposition. When viewed together, these two statues seem to convey the message that Native peoples were destined to yield to white settlement and culture. Yet today, many of us see these monuments, I've named two of the dozens that exist across Oregon, as symbols of white supremacy. And I use Washington Park as an example because nearby to these two monuments stands the Oregon Holocaust Memorial, created in 2004 to honor the memory of the millions of Jews and others murdered in the Holocaust. There were extensive design reviews, public meetings that allowed people to weigh in on the decision about its location and its appearance. The memorial, of course, highlights the pain of lives lost in the Holocaust. Today's conversation provides the opportunity to reflect on the issue of public space. How do we reconcile the contradictions inherent in how our decisions for statues and memorials to be created? How do we reckon with public displays that reinforce objectionable ideas? Fortunately, we have three stellar people with us today to delve into these complicated issues. There will be time for questions, so please use the Q&A button to place your questions. I'm going to ask that you don't put questions in the chat because I might miss them. I don't want to miss your questions. I'm going to introduce everyone, then we can start the conversation. I'll start with Ellen Eisenberg. Ellen holds the Dwight and Margaret Lear Chair in American History at Willamette University. She teaches courses on the history of the United States since the Civil War with an emphasis on immigration, ethnicity, and race. Recently, she taught a first-year seminar focusing on historical memory and the controversies over monuments. Her published work includes 5 monographs and a number of articles on American Jewish history with a focus on the American West. The first to cry down injustice, Western Jews and Japanese removal during World War II, was a 2008 National Jewish Book Award finalist. Ellen is currently editing an anthology tentatively titled Jews as Whites, Jews as Others, Relational Identities in the American West. David G. Lewis is a member of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde and descended from the Santiam, Chinook, and Tacoma tribes of Oregon. A former manager of the Culture Department at the Grand Ronde Tribe and currently faculty at Oregon State University in Anthropology and Ethnic Studies, David regularly researches, writes, and presents about the tribes of Oregon and produces a blog with historic essays, Cortex Journal. April Slabosheski worked as an educator at the museum between 2014 and 2018, where she led tours of the Oregon Holocaust Memorial, guided engagement with learners around public space and memorialization. The co-curator of our exhibition, The Holocaust, an Oregon Perspective, and recipient of travel grants to engage with sites of Holocaust memory in Poland and Germany, April is drawn to consider the ongoing and ever-changing relationships between public space and intergenerational memory. She has collaborated with the U.S. National Park Service's National Historic Landmarks Program and researched Holocaust memory through art and public space. Welcome to the three of you. Thank you so much for being here today. I'm going to start with a question for all of you that will give you perhaps a chance to introduce yourself. So I'm going to give you an opportunity to talk for a couple of minutes. Really curious about your own perspective about this controversy. What impact do these statues and memorials have upon us and the way that we teach about history? And Ellen, I think I'll start with you, if I might.
Sure. I guess by way of kind of introduction and background, I would say I came to this indirectly and over a long period of time. So on the one hand, I've for a long time taught African-American history and Reconstruction after the Civil War. And so through that, I became interested in the controversy over the Confederate statues. And at the same time, my building on Willamette's campus is situated immediately across the street from the Capitol. And I've long brought history students across to the Capitol to look at the murals and the statues and kind of as a way of thinking about how Oregon history has been told, who is centered, who is marginalized, who is erased. And I brought those both together in this course I developed that you mentioned called Whose History, Whose Memory in 2019. And it was really only as I developed that course that I really started focusing more on this image of the pioneer and those particular statues and what the image represents. And of course, I was influenced by this special issue of Oregon Historical Quarterly, focusing on white supremacy and the work of David and also Mark Carpenter. And so I've come to see the Confederate statues and the pioneer statues as really analogous to one another in that when they were erected, they really served to erase deeply problematic aspects of our history and to honor and reinforce white supremacy that was pretty much unquestioned at the time that they were erected. And so I think that the current controversies and my own perspective on this is really influenced by the increasing dissonance, right, between that has really come to the floor, this dissonance between our own values and the values that were in place at the time that they were erected and what they were designed to honor.
Thank you. David.
Thanks, Judy. You know, this has been an issue on my mind for a very long time. You know, since I was undergrad at University of Oregon and began studying sort of deeply the history of the tribes of Oregon. I also, during that time, visited other countries. And, you know, I was really struck by, you know, when I visited New Zealand and there was so much native art, you know, art up in public spaces. And there was a lot of sort of their Maori names up and stuff. And so then when I returned to Oregon and tried to place that in sort of context of where we are in Oregon, comparatively, we have very little anything native up at all. I mean, there's almost no native statues. I mean, we have some place names, but much of them have been replaced. And our presence here is greatly reduced, and that sort of helped me understand that sort of the depth of the issues that we're facing today. It's not just statues. It's, you know, you start looking at our histories, which is what I do quite a bit, and you know, our presence is erased or invisible. You know, and I always look back to that novel Invisible Man by Ellison, and I replaced the word, you know, black in there with, or African American with native, and it's exactly the same situation going on. We were invisible people in our own land, and so my work has been sort of uncovering the missing, the invisible histories of Native peoples here, and then seeing from that perspective how things have been written about us, you know, how our histories are written, what I call the master narratives, you know, of the pioneers of the Oregon Trail, of Lewis and Clark, which have predominated here for the last 180 odd years, has been the primary education about Native peoples, literally teaching about Native peoples through the eyes of the explorers and the people who were taking the land from them, which seems very strange, but when you think back on it now, but that's really where education is, and that's where people in Oregon, in all the West, get their information about Native peoples. Is from that master narrative of colonization, taking the land, removal of the peoples, putting them on reservations, and then literally forgetting about them because they're no longer part of our society. They become invisible. They become, you know, something else. And so the other. And then our tribes, you know, were terminated in the 50s, and we became literally non-Indians, you know, strangers in our own land, you know, if you want to borrow that book title, the stranger in the land, and almost like newly arrived immigrants to our own territory, really. And so these are sort of interesting perspectives, I think, from a Native perspective on that master narrative, which is really built upon this idea of American or white American supremacy over the land, which has sort of was picked up on by their descendants and by, you know, the writers of that history in their statues and their monuments and everything else. And so everywhere we go is a reminder to Native peoples that we were sort of, we lost everything, we have nothing, we have no presence, we have no history, we have no, at some level, rights to be a part of the society, that we live in today. So there's a lot more to be said there, but I want to turn it over to April.
Thank you. April.
Yeah, I and now I'm just in everything David said. Thanks. I guess when I think about these questions, I'm certainly not a pioneer monument expert by any means, but so I really draw on my experiences with Holocaust memorials and thinking about these contemporary designs, which may be a little bit out of place in time, because some of the memorials we'll be talking about were designed before the Holocaust, although others were, I think when the four of us got together to talk earlier, we discovered some of them were designed in the 1990s. So, scholars of Holocaust memorials talk about the ways in which Holocaust memorialization and memory really influences the design of contemporary memorials, whether or not they're about the Holocaust. And I think, maybe we can talk a little bit more about how and why in a little bit, but I think a big part of the reason for that is because those design concepts that are often used in Holocaust memorials really pull people into an experience that's really intimate and personal of remembering. And it's really the work of those memorials to do that. And I really see that in contrast to the pioneer monuments and memorials we're talking about, in that they tell a very simple story. They are a simple elevation of a historical myth of pioneer heroism and unconditionally positive regard. And so thinking about what's going on with the toppling and the removal of these statues today, I really see that a lot of people are pulling themselves into engagement with these memorials and not waiting to be invited by them. And I think that's really both interesting and exciting to see that that work is being done.
Yeah, thank you, April. And if I could hold you just for a minute, just to dig down a little bit more. I mean, I think what we're really talking about, these monuments and memorials in public space, right? That's really, I think, where we're focusing the conversation today. And I think it would really help us if each of you, and I'd love to start first with April, tell us a little bit more about public space and memory. What does it really mean to memorialize someone or honor someone at a moment of time? And what works, what doesn't work? Given this explosive conversation, this explosive dispute that we're entering into, how do we deal with public space and memory? And April, can I look to you to start that off?
Yeah, oh my goodness, what a question. I think this could be like a whole panel or a series of panels. What is public space and memory? And I think there are many scholars and activists who have really engaged with the question of how are we, public space is not just given, right? This is something that is regulated. Our parks, our civic squares, our sidewalks and streets, they're regulated, and there's a tenuousness there. They're not just going to be there forever. And somebody with power and with resources has decided that they will go where they're going to go, and also has the authority to say how they'll look and what will be there, and what kind of behaviors are invited in those spaces, and also who is invited and who is excluded. So I think that those are huge questions that I'm not going to answer by any means, but I just jotted down, David, when you said that there's been this white American supremacy over the land. I think public space is absolutely bounded by and by that supremacy too. So I kind of think of public space as a primary source in which we can ask ourselves, like, what was trying to be conveyed, who was the invited audience, who is excluded, and how can we tell? And those questions really depend on our embodied experience in these places, by using our senses and our feelings to think about how we are in that space, and that will be different for everybody. And it's definitely connected to public memory, which I think of as related to the term collective memory, which was coined by the scholar Maurice Halbwachs in the 1920s, and existed well before it was coined, and is just a concept that we can use to think about the ways that we choose what to remember and what is important to us, that is group specific, and it's based on our values, and it both determines what culture is, and it also shapes culture, right? So there's like this give and take between collective memory and culture, and it's different than history. It's biased, and there's a reason we remember certain things and decide not to remember other things.
Thank you. Fascinating. David, do you want to add anything?
Well, I am interested by this idea of the commons, common spaces, common lands, and this idea of saying, of talking about the public, and what is open to the public, what is open to the commons. Native people who were placed on reservations in the 1850s were not U.S. citizens. They're not part of that American public, legally, and were sort of made to stay on reservations for 100 years. And if they did leave with permission from the agent, they were made to sort of have a pass, or they would be subject to arrest. And this is, them going, when they would leave, they would go back to their original homelands and do some hunting or fishing or whatever. Sometimes they would do, they would hire themselves on to do harvesting of crops in the valley here. But we were native, my ancestors were disallowed from being part of that public, that commons. So, that commons population for a very long time. And though we are now citizens since 1924 under federal law, but still Native people were sort of, in a sense, made to stay, or chose to stay then on the reservations, because it was where their communities were. It was where there was some opportunity for them for the next 30 or 40 years, until in Oregon we had termination. And so then tribes were sort of said, those in Western Oregon were said, you had to leave your reservation. You're no longer Indians. You're supposed to integrate with society. But nothing in society reflects our values and who we are, our history, because that was all replaced by mostly white Americans, because even blacks were disallowed for a while to come to Oregon. So that was all, we were displaced completely, lost all of our lands, lost all of our rights. And yet we were supposed to in the 1950s integrate back into society. And so nowadays I look back, I'm a descendant. I grew up in a mainly somewhat egalitarian society, where I'm supposed to have the rights of everybody else. I didn't grow up necessarily on a reservation at all. And I'm looking around me, I don't see anything like me. So, and I actually see a lot of continued narrative that this is a white place. This is not a Native place. And then there's pushback when we try to write our own histories, as we're some sort of revisionist writers. And now there's a lot of talk about, well, we're canceling all the culture that came before us. And I was thinking, I was talking to some Native people online the other day. I said, wait a minute, who was canceled, really? I mean, we were the ones that originally were canceled. all of our perspectives, all of our culture, all of our rights were canceled originally by the white Americans who came here and then imposed their own images and power upon the land. And so that's where I'm coming from. That's where we are, most Native people are coming from, this idea that we didn't have any rights. And in many ways, we don't have any rights or images of ourselves or presence of our peoples in the lands that we originally lived on for 10 to 15,000 years, which is a very deep history. And that is, when you start thinking about it like that, it's kind of sobering, you know, like how long have the Americans been here? How long have Native people been here? And how come I can't go out into the world today? This is what a lot of us are asking. How come I can't go out into the world today and see positive images of our people? Why do I have to go? Why do I, when I go to the state capitol, do I see us groveling at the feet of the pioneers, you know, that are sort of taking all of our stuff, all of our land, all of our rights and everything else? And that's all we really see. There's little images of us groveling at their feet, asking for the, you know, the something to survive on. So I guess I'll stop there now. I mean, I could go on for a couple days on this, but just like April was saying, but that's where I'm at with this.
Oh, thank you. Ellen, do you want to add anything to this question?
Sorry about that. I apologize if you can hear the sound of chainsaws outside and there are a lot of trees down in my neighborhood and there are all sorts of chainsaws going. So yeah, I think that April and David covered that really well. I guess the one thing that I would try to amplify is the sense that while we call it the public square, the people who, that makes it sound so democratic, right? But of course, the people who have been able to control what is erected in the public square, that has not been an inclusive, in the past, that has not been an inclusive and necessarily democratic project. And so these are representations of the people who had the power and the resources to be able to, you know, put up gigantic statues of the folks that they wanted to honor that represented a particular history that was important to them. But that doesn't mean that it's the end all and be all of our history.
Yeah, I think you sort of painted. Were you done? I'm sorry, did I interrupt you?
Go ahead.
I think you kind of anticipated my next question in some way, because I think you're right. We use this word public space and we like to think that it sort of reflects the needs and the priorities of the community, but it isn't necessarily a democratic process, what gets established in those spaces. So I think it does lead to the question of, do we actually believe that statues and memorials should be the way for communities to shape future generations' understanding of history? If no, why? If you think not, if yes, how do we do it? How do we curate? How do we contextualize what we feel is important for later generations to know? I mean, this, yeah, and I think April, you know, will draw on her experience with Holocaust memorials, which neither of you will, Ellen and David probably won't. So David, can I start with you with that? Is there a place?
Oh yeah, there's clearly a spot. I mean, we do. I mean, and since, you know, for 20 something years now or more, maybe we've been there's been tries working on positive memorials, positive representations of who they are. I know if you drive some highways, tribes like the Uintillas and stuff have been putting up overpass, you know, sculptures and stuff where it shows salmon or horses going over overpasses. They're very sort of native images. We did work also. I do a lot of like consultation work with ODOT in the Eugene area when they put up the new overcrossing for the Willamette, and we did all kinds of native statues in the sort of Kalapuya theme down there, where there's like camas and baskets, stuff like that. Very positive native theme. So there is some stuff out there. Clearly, yeah. I mean, there absolutely. And then part of it is also like place naming. Tribes are really in Oregon have been working really well, renaming places that have a negative connotation, like the squaw place names and the Dead Indian Road place names, things like that, or in Oregon. And I've actually helped with a few of those projects, renaming recently a Squaw Creek in Tillamook County. We named it Nestucca Bob Creek, and so after an old ancestral tribal member. And so we have been doing these things. It's a slow process. I helped name Tillicum Crossing Bridge too. So these things are beginning to enter society, but there are these sort of foundational master narratives in Oregon still today, where you can see it. The biggest representation is the pioneer statue on top of the Capitol building. This idea that that's the founding, I guess, figure for Oregon is very negative to tribes. Very negative to tribal people. Even though we have a very good relationship with the state of Oregon, it's still this thing we have to sort of get around every day. Every day we see it. I live in Salem. I see it like every other day or something, and it's pretty tall, and you can see it everywhere, and it's a big gold pioneer representing not just one but two different situations where gold miners a lot of times were exterminating Indian people down in Southern Oregon, Northern California, while the pioneers are coming in taking all of our land. So there's these two different histories that work there. And Oregon has done some good work replacing some public monuments, things like signs that have statues of the what we call the mascot Indians on them and stuff. Replacing the mascot images in high schools and other schools in Oregon. That work is going on right now and has been going on for several years. So there is some good work happening that we're working on, but still we're still surrounded by an overwhelming number of statues. Like just in what's it called, Johnson Park over here in at the Capitol. There's all these statues of previous figures in Oregon that are representations of that colonization. The circuit rider who was a minister, or a missionary, Jason Lee who took Native children off the Willamette Plains and forced them to sort of speak English and wear American clothing and take American names. There's all these images that are incredibly negative towards Native peoples.
Thank you. Ellen, anything to add?
Yeah, so I think the question, remind me where the question started, was about what can work and what doesn't. Is that where we were? Yeah.
Should we have, is this idea of using public space as disputed as public space might be, is this a reasonable form of helping future generations understand history, to erect these monuments and memorials?
The monuments and memorials are really less about understanding history. I think that they tend to be more representations of values at a particular point in time. And I think we need to recognize that those can change over time. It seems to me that a lot of the statues that are most problematic are, that one heroic guy on a pedestal kind of statues. And when I think of memorials that work better, they're memorials that are more about challenging ideas and calling on us to kind of contemplate something that has happened in the past, or something along those lines. So I think of like the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, or some of the Holocaust memorials, or the lynching memorial that went up in Alabama a few years ago, or these kind of memorials that are not about taking one individual and raising him, and it's almost always a man, raising him above everyone else, presenting him as a flawless hero, who should be emulated. I think those, not surprisingly, often are the ones that become incredibly problematic, as opposed to those that call upon us to be a little bit more reflective.
April?
Yeah, I'm just loving everything that what David and Ellen have already offered, and to maybe build or to take some of what Ellen was just saying. I agree that completely that a lot of memorials and monuments really do represent a value of the time, and it's been an interesting conversation with regard to contemporary atrocity memorials in the United States, and I would say in Europe too. The question of, do we want to preserve and communicate historical facts, or are we looking to maybe engage more with this idea of memory and experience and like a felt sense? And a lot of arguments that have come out of those conversations are that the conversations themselves about the design of memorials are maybe as important as the memorials themselves or the monuments themselves, in terms of shifting social opinion, public opinion, and shifting the perspectives that are included or excluded and elevated, and really elevating, I would say, historically silenced perspectives on some of these events. So I think that memorials and monuments can serve as a symbol of those conversations and the values that are inherent in them. And I also think that memorials and monuments can do a lot in terms of giving us a felt, embodied sense, being in that space in the moment, that can help inform how we approach or think about the historical event. Judy, you asked, should they be a way for communities to do that? So I definitely see some value there, but it's complicated.
It is so complicated. So what do? We have a country. I think isn't it reasonable to say we have a country full of statues and memorials that embody racist, white supremacist messages, right? We know that some people say that if you remove them, you're wiping away history, right? I think we who do this work, we think of history as the stories we tell about what happened in the past, and of course the stories we are presently constructing. So that does certainly open up the pathway for us to re-envision what are currently in our public spaces. So how do we respond to that? That if you take these things away, you are erasing history. And there is a question in the chat that is similar to one I wanted to ask. So do they have to go? Is there a way to contextualize them? If they have to go, is a museum an appropriate place for them to be in with the proper context? Or do they literally have to be melted down? April, I recall in our planning session, you said that some of the memorials to Hitler after the war, they were melted down and used for other purposes. So, we can recycle many of these statues. So I'll start with David, if I might. Oh, you're muted.
So,
That's it.
I'm sorry, I was looking at some of the questions in the Q&A. Can you ask a question again? I'm sorry.
Oh, what was I saying? So, some people will say that if we take some of these disputed statues and memorials down, we're erasing history.
Okay. Yeah.
So what do we do? Do we take them down? Do we put them in a museum? Do we keep them up in context? I know I don't know if you saw this week, I saw an article in The Guardian where it looks like in Britain, they're kind of making a decree or whatever, not to take the statues down, but to actually contextualize them. And there's, of course, a lot of complaint against that. So that's really my question.
Well, I think it's a matter for the public nowadays to decide. I think there should be a public process. There should be a democratic process where they have people that are involved in this discussion, whether, as in some sort of community town meeting or something, or appointments to a commission or a committee to just to have a discussion about these things and make recommendations to various counties or cities or the state itself. I think that absolutely should be part of the discussion. Maybe the Heritage Commission today is working on these kind of things, these ideas. I don't know. But I think, this idea that taking down a statue is erasing history is, I'm not sure how you would erase the Oregon history of the Oregon Trail and the Gold Rush. I mean, I think that would be somewhat impossible right now because that statue is not necessarily history. It's simply a representation of a piece of that history from a certain perspective. Contextualizing it may be one way to go. Perhaps replacing it or adding to the statue, or even letting your community decide that we're a different community today than we were 80 years ago, and therefore we want a different representation out there. We have that right to decide. We're not the same community we were 80 years ago. So yes, maybe they need to go into museums, and then could be contextualized inside a museum as a time period in our history when a lot of these statues were erected at that one time, which is what we have in Oregon. Seems appropriate, and there's something to be said for doing things in sort of a museum way, where sometimes museums will put away art or statues for a generation or so and then bring them back out 10, 20 years from now and reintroduce them to society, and then they become new again and people are interested in them again and they are important again. But I think that there are all kinds of ways to doing this, and I think with democratic, fair, and equal discussions of the community, we can come to some good decision. I'm not of the opinion that we should just trash them all and throw them all, in some deep hole somewhere. I absolutely think that some things should remain. I don't understand why anybody took down the elk statue in Portland. I thought the Roosevelt elk statue was really important there. I think it should remain. There's no obvious sort of negative connotation to that. So there's various ways to go, and I think there are some people that are a little more active about saying we should get rid of all of them. There was a question in chat to quickly answer that, because we have some chat questions now about Washington and Lincoln statues. And I'm not of the opinion we should get rid of the Washington and Lincoln statues. They're not really, I mean, they have some negative pieces in their political careers, absolutely, like just about every single politician we know. But they are not the most horrendous histories out there in statue form. We have Nazi statues and Confederate statues, and we have golden pioneers that are representations of a horrible time period where people did horrible things. So I think we should deal with, have some sort of a priority list about, dealing with or deciding what to do with certain statues first, before we deal with the ones that are less problematic.
Thank you. Ellen, why don't you chime in?
She just actually left because she was having some problems, so hopefully she will rejoin.
Oh, she did leave. I didn't even notice. All right, April. And April, I don't know whether this is appropriate or not, but as David is talking, I'm thinking there has, the world is in crisis right now. But one of the things we've noticed, the anti-Semitism is on the rise. That is known. It's on the rise in the United States. If you look at numbers coming out of the Anti-Defamation League, you can see documentation of every single anti-Semitic act in the country that is recorded. I think here, so April, in thinking about this question, I am thinking about the memorial, and because the museum stewards the memorial, I'm up there a lot at the Holocaust Memorial. how do we know 30 years from now this memorial is going to be in dispute the way Sacagawea, or the white man coming to Oregon, or the pioneer family, or the U of O memorial? Like, what? That's my question.
Yeah. Well, I think just connecting back to the original question, it really comes down to who is empowered and who is in power to share their story and to choose what our public spaces look like. And thinking about that memorial, I just think about the group of Holocaust survivors who worked together for 10 years to design this memorial. And the question about whether these memorials should stay in place, I don't feel personally like in the position to really say. I think it's a question for people whose stories have been silenced, right, for generations, to answer. But I do also see that there is an enormous amount of authority in just having a memorial there in the first place, and it's not a democratic process, right? We'll just keep going back to that.
Right.
So I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah. So what about the difference? Here's a question from the chat. Do you see a difference between memorials created at the site of events as to those addressing sites, events that happen far away? We have the Vietnam Memorial, we've got the Holocaust Memorial, we've got others. So is there a qualitative difference between them? Quantitative difference between them? David, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is. Yeah, I mean, all my memorials, some of the memorials about distant events, are really an aspect of providing some memory of that event in our society. Things that are so eventful, so sometimes horrendous, that they should never be forgotten, such as the Holocaust or whatever. I think the one type of statue that we have in the United States that's like that, besides the Holocaust memorials across the United States, would be the Christopher Columbus statues that are across many that were in many towns across the United States. I know that the one in San Francisco was put up by I guess Italian American community, but it was always strange to me that we so honored Columbus Day on the West Coast, when, or even in the Americas, as kind of the U.S. history, when there was no United States when Columbus was alive or did anything, and he never landed on the continent. And everybody has known for generations, for perhaps hundreds of years, that he did some pretty horrendous stuff to other people. And yet there are communities that have sort of discounted all that negativity by looking at all the positive he did, in sort of finding this sort of new world to colonize and to, I don't know. I mean, it really is. You have to look at each statue, each thing on a case by case basis, and poll the community about what they feel. It's hard to. It's for me. It's hard to lump everything. I really want to look at each one, contextualize it more, because a lot of times it's not properly contextualized, and then open it up to the community to make a decision about that.
So I'd like to just drill down, and it is a question in the chat, and back to this issue of public space and who owns it and whose decision it is to actually remove a statue. And when we say community, I guess I have a two-part question. Can you envision a process, a community-wide process, where the decision to take down a statue becomes a community-wide decision, whatever that might look like. And then, you know, given what we have seen with the protests since George Floyd's murder and the toppling, the literal toppling of these statues, I think I'll just ask you simply, what is your reaction to that? It was certainly a way to get the conversation accelerated and into more people's minds than ever before. It was also a way to get some of these statues down and out. But just reflect a little bit on what has happened since last March and whether you think that has helped the conversation or whether inherently you object to toppling the statues in this way. And Ellen, I'll start with you. We're glad to have you back.
Thanks. I'm afraid we had a power outage briefly and an internet outage here, but it seems to be back on for the moment. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the challenges with the number of stakeholders that there are and just the ways in which bureaucratic processes go is that these conversations, while possible, can drag on for an incredibly long time. And we've seen that in a lot of the situations with the Confederate statues and so on. I think we saw that with the Pioneer and the Pioneer Mother down at University of Oregon, where the students have been protesting those statues for decades. And it had sort of come to a head in recent years. And, you know, there tends to be you turn it over to one committee and then another committee and so on. And so it tends to be an extraordinarily slow process. And there certainly have been, I think, coming from the university world, there have been a number of universities who have tackled these kinds of questions in recent years and have managed to make community decisions that involved alumni and current students and employees and so on. And so there are models for having those kinds of conversations and coming to resolution. I think, this summer frustration just boiled over and people just determined to act on their own. Personally, I would like to see a process of education where people can really, I think at this point in Oregon, there are still a lot of people who grew up, learning the traditional pioneer stuff that was taught in school and really don't have any real notion that these are even controversial yet. I think it's really unlike the Confederate conversation, which has been going on for a really long time. I think this is new to a lot of people. And so I think that a real effort to go out into the public square and try to educate people about why these statues are so problematic would go a long way, I think.
Great, thank you. Ellen, or April or David, do you want to chime in? Either of you want to?
I am intrigued by this question and the one before it, which is about the difference of a memorial in the place where something happened versus not. And I think they're related because, or maybe I'm just relating them. But I think that as far as the toppling goes, the sites where these statues have stood has now become kind of a symbol of absence, which I think really relates to the impact of the pioneers in this place and the impact of colonization is there's an absence of something that was once here, and it's due to violence. And I think a big difference between memorials that are on the site of where something happened and not is that the ones on site often include and draw on like the physical markings of that event. So in that way, we can see absence maybe in a way that, in a new way after that removal. And I think that's really powerful. It speaks volumes.
I do have something to say about this. Thank you, April, for that. It reminded me of some other thoughts I had on these issues. When we last summer, I was actually for a time teaching, at least in the spring, at PSU. And so some of my students in my class, which was an all online class, of course, were at, like, the last half of the class were spending all their nights out demonstrating, while, so it was the very strangest thing. So I had, the class was about Oregon natives, and we were talking about Oregon native history and colonization, all this stuff. And yet these people were out demonstrating for Black Lives Matter every single night. And many of them actually wanted to turn in some sort of video log of their activities in the evening for the class, because they had this interesting relationship, or like almost like a straight relationship between their activating for Black Lives Matter, as kind of, I think some of them were even sort of anarchists in some way, maybe, and the class content itself. They didn't see much difference, and I didn't necessarily allow that, but I didn't try to help them along like that. But it was a very interesting relationship. So I think, and I've been teaching for a good number of years now, some 15 or more years now, and when I teach about Oregon history, Oregon Native history, the overwhelming comments I get in my classes are, how come we didn't learn about this before? And why is it that my high school teachers or whoever taught me this about Oregon history or Native history or American history have lied to me now, and I have to unlearn all these things I thought I learned about US history, about American history, about Native history, and learn a new way of thinking about things. And this has been going on for me for 15 years in all my classes. And I think that there is a lot of cultural stuff built up in our society where people know, and it's just not, and I'm not the only one doing it. I bet you there's a lot of college instructors that encounter this all the time, that they know that there's a certain narrative that's talked about, that's taught in our society about how wonderful everything is, and yet when people become educated in these things, they realize it's not exactly the case at all. In fact, it may be directly the opposite, that there's a much more negativity to the United States than all the positive histories about the United States there is out there. That Americans are absolutely involved in genocide. They were absolutely involved in illegally taking land from Native peoples, part of slavery, all kinds of sort of negative histories out there. And people know these things, and they're upset, especially the younger people. They're very upset that they have to live in a society where we're still lying about our histories. We're lying about what these things mean. And so these people will go out, then have been going out and seeing these public displays. They learn something different in class, yet they go out and they see a statue, and they see a little bit of the little plaque on the statue that doesn't necessarily represent really history, but a certain version of history, and they saying, this is completely wrong. Why am I always seeing errors in history, wrong history all the time in front of me all the time, when I'm learning from a wide number of my professors a totally opposite story. And this needs to be corrected. And I think that there's a lot of cultural stuff built up in our society of people wanting to be told the truth, constantly being told not that that they don't deserve the truth, that somehow the educators are saving us from ourselves, or saving our kids from the truth because they can't handle it, they can't take it. I think that we need to really address these things in our educational policies and our policies as to what is our true history of our country, of our people, because now we're all part of this. I mean, Native people are Americans. We have the same rights as any other American, so our history also has the same rights as any other American history. And I think I'll leave it at that.
Oh, thank you. And I really appreciate you bringing this up. And, in a sense, as relevant and important right now as the dispute is, the larger issue as you raise it is really our education system. And we see that, I'm sure, April, you were a leader in education at the museum, and the number of classes that would come in and go through our core exhibition, Discrimination and Resistance, in Oregon Primer, and educators, the teachers, the parents, and certainly the students were just gobsmacked when they learned the history of discrimination in this state. So there's no question about that. So there is a question in the chat. It's a little repetitive, but I mean, it might have you repeat a couple of things we've already spoken about, but I think I like the way it was phrased. Can pioneer or white narrative be altered to include stories and histories, or does it have to be erased? So I don't think the question is necessarily recontextualizing the statues in place, but is there, can we alter this history, or do we just have to erase it? Ellen, you're.
Well, I think we can tell the history in a more truthful way. And I think that's something that all of us are talking about here. I mean, it's not, I don't know that the pioneer is going to vanish from the landscape or something like that, but we can tell that story and tell also, tell it in the context of settler colonialism and, all of these people who were coming here to get this land that was not empty land. And it was, that this was land that was occupied by Native Americans and that was taken from them forcibly. And that's not to demonize the individuals. I mean, I think it's very important for us to understand that the people, those people, those pioneers, I mean, there are different classes. So there are those who David's written about who were, participated in violent massacres. And there were also people who were products of their society, and the prevailing belief among them was that, they didn't think of themselves as horrible people. They mostly thought of themselves as whatever, good Christian people or something like that. And it calls upon us, I think, to examine our own values and our own times and what are the things that we don't see, instead of, I think it's so easy, for us to look back and say, oh, isn't that terrible what they did? But I think we need to think about what are people in 50 years going to look back at us and say, well, why didn't they see that injustice that they were committing? So I think it challenges us in that way, and history can be reframed in that way. I also think that there are people, there weren't a lot, but there were some people who spoke out against that violence. And those people, have not been sufficiently recognized in history. And in some cases, they were kind of chased out of town. And so I think we might want to think about who we hold up and who we highlight as we tell that history.
April, David, anything to add? And then I have one last question.
Go ahead, April.
Yeah, the question, can we alter this history, feels facts, like a question about facts when I hear it at first. And I know we've already sort of talked about how we can or cannot, like we can't change this history, and we can't erase this history because it's in our bodies and in our land and in the structures around us. So I guess the only thing I would add is that I'm really interested in our feelings and the feelings we have about our relationship with this history, and that's different for everybody. But I do think that memorials can help us get deeper in touch with our feelings about who we are in relationship with this history. And I think that is, if we're to continue to use built public space-based and place-based memorials, I think that's the work of I think that should be their job.
I think that
At least in
yeah,
part.
I think that if memorials are a reflection of our history, which I'm kind of making that assumption in my statements, because in many ways I think they are kind of a reflection of the history as written, or maybe the more common history, public history that's as written. That if that I really don't think that we have written Oregon history yet. I think we've written a version of it.
Mhm.
You know, I mean, I think there are writers of the past. I mean, I've looked at histories going back to the 1850s, and there have been versions of Oregon history written from certain perspectives, but I have never seen an all-inclusive history of Oregon. So really, that suggests that we really haven't written the history of Oregon, and that once that is written from the numerous perspectives, you know, I think we'll have numerous histories at that point, and that would be that if that's what you're doing, if that's what you're writing is an inclusive history of Oregon with multiple perspectives, then there will be no more white supremacist history. It'll be gone. Clearly, white supremacists can write their own history, and that will be a thing of the future. But then we would have a much better history that I would hope that the majority of people would turn to, because you know we are not just white people living in Oregon anymore. There's a whole lot of different ethnicities living here that have really unique histories, not just Native peoples. There's Black histories, there's Latino histories, there's Chinese and Japanese and Filipino and Hawaiians and I got to mention Jewish history of Oregon as well. And so there's all these different histories of Oregon, the people who came here for various reasons, and so there's not really one history, but I think whatever comes out of this era that we're in has to be more inclusive, has to use multiple voices, has to at least try to get to all the perspectives that it can.
Thank you. And I think, David, that really was my last question. And April and Ellen, I think, David, you answered it so eloquently. And I want to give April and Ellen a chance to, what is next in the reckoning? I mean, I think re-envisioning Oregon history is absolutely something we should be doing. And I'd like to think that at the museum, we are taking baby steps to make that happen. Ellen, do you have?
Yeah, I have a couple of thoughts. First, I'd just like to piggyback on what David was just saying. I mean, I think when that fuller kind of multi-dimensional history is written, we have to recognize that it's not just the individual groups, all the different groups that David mentioned, but they impinge on one another's history. So speaking personally, so I've been writing Oregon Jewish history, and fairly recently, just a few years back, when I was looking at Jews as the early Jewish immigration to Oregon and their role as pioneers, the narrative was kind of like, wow, isn't it amazing that Jews were accepted early on in Oregon? But now, having read more and immersing myself in this whole question of pioneers, I've completely rethought that. And it's not, it's a question of, well, Jews were accepted into white society, and then what are the implications of that for their participation as pioneers, right? In terms of, all the problematic things that pioneers did and dispossession of Native peoples that they were a part of. They weren't the leaders of, but they definitely, to the extent that they were accepted, and they were full participants in this. And so it causes us to rethink, right, as we uncover these various histories and come to terms with them, they affect one another. And so I think that will be part of the telling of this story. And I think, our young people in many ways are going to lead the way. Last week in class, my class read David's article about the violence in Southern Oregon. And most of my students reacted exactly the way that he said his students react. They say, why didn't anyone ever teach us this before? Why didn't we know this before? I paired that reading with the Oregon Historical Society's curriculum for elementary students that it has put out, the new curriculum. And it's really interesting. They were just stunned to see the difference between what most of them got as kids in school, mostly in Oregon, Washington, and California, and what kids are going to be getting now, right? Which is a much fuller recognition of Native peoples and their histories here from time immemorial and continuing histories here. And I think in many ways, you know, it will be interesting to see what a generation that is educated with that fuller perspective of history rather than just the pioneers as heroes, what will they lead us to in the future?
Thank you. April.
Yeah, I think when I think about, I'm not sure what's next, and I'm not sure if it's up to me to decide, but I also, when I think about Holocaust history and reckoning, I think about I think about all of that memory and memorialization as a small part of a larger process that was about repair and healing and I guess reparation and restitution. So, and I see that memorials and the way that we use our public space is a tool to have this conversation and to symbolize this conversation, and it's one part, right? And the process of Holocaust reparation has included the legal pursuit of justice in the justice system, and it's included economic restitution and reparation. It's included determining what to do with land, a process of truth telling and listening on the part of survivors and perpetrators and others. So I think it's a really big process, and what is next and what is needed in that process came from survivors often. So I think that we need to, and the people whose stories have been silenced. So I think that is where I would look for what's next.
Thank you. I think that's a great place to end. I know we could go on for a long time, but as I said, I hope this will be the first of a few programs we hope to offer on this subject. I want to thank you so much, Professor Lewis, Professor Eisenberg, April Slabosheski. Thank you so much for contributing today. I hope everyone out there is safe and warm and healthy, and look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you so much for your participation. We are saving the chat and the Q&A, and I think we're able, is that right, April? Amber, we're able to send them out when we send out the recording.
That's what I wanted to say before everyone leaves. I will be sending the chat out. I will be sending some of these resources, and anyone that has signed up and couldn't come and people who have been here today will all get an email with the recording to this as well as all those resources.
Thank you so much. Be well.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.